the first album on Atlantic called The Divine Miss M. Would you welcome Bette Midler?
The stage is bathed in a warm, smoky amber hue. The iconic multicolored curtain hangs still.
Oh, you should have seen that. That was a hot one. That was hot.
That was a barn burner, huh?
What?
A barn burner, huh?
Oh, you know it, yeah. Silver lame, sequins, orchids. It was fabulous. It really was.
You wearing some more of those costumes?
Oh, honey. More clown suits, you mean? Every night in Las Vegas, I would leave the stage and John would come on and he would say,
The crowd's roar is deafening, punctuated by the rhythmic, booming cadence of Ed McMahon's. Out steps a man in a perfectly tailored plaid blazer.
In the winter, you don't put your tongue on the pump handle.
No, that's true. We always, and another thing, you don't have, like water in the house, and we always made jokes like we had running water when we'd run and get it, because we...
Did you have a well?
We had...
Silver hair neatly parted, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers.
I was hurt and downhearted, and disappointment was my closest friend.
He does his trademark golf swing, cracks a self-deprecating joke about the network brass, and sits down behind the most powerful desk in the history of entertainment.
I never play cards with women. Women always say, what are these two ones with wearing the crowns? Yeah, you ever sit down and play poker with women, you explain, and all of a sudden you get killed.
You mean to tell me that people play with you? Play cards, poker with you?
You know, I didn't play in the service when I was in the Navy.
For 30 years, Johnny Carson was the undisputed king of late night. He was cool, unflappable, and in complete control. He was the ultimate gatekeeper of American celebrity.
This in 14 and a half
well,
years.
Mostly because you didn't ask me.
Oh, come on. No, I think when
No.
we did ask you were probably out on tour because you travel constantly,
Right.
don't you?
We do a lot of road shows, and I want you to know, though, that I am so excited today, because today's my birthday, and I couldn't...
If he laughed at your joke, you had a career. If he invited you over to the couch, you were anointed.
that boy could have come in there and taken my money without me inviting him, you know? If I had said...
That's the way people who rob places usually do it. They normally...
He spent 3 decades playing psychological chess with the biggest egos in Hollywood, and Johnny always won. But every king has a weakness. And if you look closely at the archival footage, if you study the way his hands suddenly fiddle with his pencils, the way his neck turns a deep, panicked crimson, or the way he leans back in his chair as if trying to escape an oncoming tidal wave, you will see something rare. You will see Johnny Carson lose control.
really dangerous, where you felt a little...
Oh, golly, you caught me off guard.
Well, I'd certainly like to catch you. That's the ground.
There were a handful of women who refused to play by Johnny's rules.
Come on home. You leave the birthday station at a quarter to 4. I read a magazine and you're in Baltimore. I dinner on my diner, another Kobe China. I then do have your Hamanix in Carolina.
To do that as a kid.
Yes, but you were not available. That was the hardest thing I could.
Do you have to learn shuffle and deal, you mean?
Yeah, and I...
Women who didn't care about his gatekeeper status. They didn't sit demurely on the couch, waiting for polite questions about their domestic lives. Instead, they walked into his studio, hijacked his physical space, weaponized their wit, and did the impossible. They made Johnny Carson nervous. This is the untold story of the hidden power shifts, the shocking betrayals, and the legendary encounters behind the curtain of The Tonight Show. The nights when the king realized he was no longer the most dangerous person in the room.
We'll be right back.
To understand how a guest could terrify Johnny Carson, you first have to understand the sheer physical geometry of The Tonight Show. Johnny's set was designed as a psychological fortress.
WC Field. Oh, yes. That was WC, wasn't it?
Yes, it did. Show us some card dexterity.
The desk was elevated slightly higher than the guest couch. Johnny sat on a swivel chair, giving him total control over when to look at the guest and when to turn to the camera.
Well, I've never heard them play that much country, but I'm sure as good as they are, they could.
Tommy, you know country western, don't you?
I know it very well.
Sure, you see, they can do all that
well,
stuff.
Great. Well, if my gang leaves me, maybe we can...
The guest was expected to walk out, wave to the crowd, sit exactly where the floor manager directed, and wait for Johnny to lead the conversation. Then came August 12th, 1970.
would you welcome this? And this February and March, she's going to be touring in concert with Mac Davis. Would you welcome Dolly Parton? Dolly. But inside, they're really kind of.
Yeah,
like
it is
kid,
nice.
thrilled.
And everybody in my band remembered my birthday, and they all got me a card and a little gift. And that makes you feel real special.
Yeah.
Because I told them yesterday better.
Or they'll be on a band by themselves.
No.
Well, you've had all.
Out walked a young singer from Honolulu by way of the New York underground. Her name was Bette Midler, but her cult following knew her as the Divine Miss M. She didn't wear a sleek, glamorous gown like the starlets of the 1960s. She wore a wild, vintage cabaret outfit that looked like it had been pulled from a thrift shop.
Shadow, and I had just gotten married, so I was also a new wife in real life. And we were on location in Rome.
She had a mane of frizzy hair and an energy that felt less like a television interview and more like a Category 5 hurricane. When Midler approached the couch, she didn't just sit down. She practically collapsed into it, shifting her weight, throwing her arms over the back of the seat, and looking at Carson not with reverence, but with a brassy, uninhibited challenge.
That's not really why he don't watch me or go to
just find
shows.
that so.
It kind of makes him kind of nervous, I guess. I don't.
I would just say the interest would be there, you know. Say, hey,
Oh,
my
the
wife.
interest is there. He wants me to do good, and he's real proud when I get to do things like the Tonight Show.
And you don't think he'll even watch tonight and watch you?
No, he won't, even though he'd probably love to. He'll make me tell the jokes you told from the show. That's why I was over there watching him. But he's a wonderful person, and it's not anything out of...
You look a little tense, Johnny, she purred. For the first time in years, Carson's trademark Midwestern composure cracked. In the archival tapes, you can see his eyes widen. He adjusts his tie, a classic psychological tell that an individual is trying to regain control of an overwhelming situation. Where did this energy come from? It came from an environment that Carson's mainstream, primetime television network had no blueprint for.
And decided it was time to make some phone calls. But of course, just then the director said, okay, we're ready. So, nothing we could do. We were just stuck in bed. Oh, well, somebody's got to be there. And, you know, Kirk, I've known you since that picture and before, and you've always been such an exciting man, and I love...
The Continental Baths. Before exploding onto national television, Midler had spent months honing her act at a legendary gay bathhouse in the basement of the Ansonia Hotel in New York City. Accompanied by a brilliant, then-unknown pianist named Barry Manilow, Midler performed for crowds of men wearing nothing but towels. In that environment, you couldn't be polite. You couldn't be subtle. You had to be loud, campy, fiercely independent, and completely unapologetic.
Blood in our veins would take her in a second. You look awfully good in rollers, let me tell you.
Methinks thou dost protest too much about being in a beauty parlor.
I just told the story, that's all.
Simple
But she was hiding, you know.
He did get the salon worked up. They were thrilled to see you.
Well,
But I was so embarrassed, so I got that out of
Does
my
that bother
system.
you because you had rollers in your hair?
Yes, I think it's the worst way a woman
I've
can
seen
be
you with
caught.
rollers in your hair.
When she brought that exact bathhouse energy onto the Tonight Show stage, it blew the doors off the studio. Johnny was used to guests who wanted his approval. Midler didn't need his approval. She already had an army behind her. During her early appearances, Midler routinely hijacked the physical space of the interview. She would lean directly into Carson's personal bubble, making wild, sweeping gestures that forced him to physically lean back in his chair to escape her orbit. When she spoke about her underground roots, casually referencing topics that pushed the absolute limits of NBC's standard formatting guidelines, you can see Ed McMahon in the background looking genuinely panicked, his eyes darting toward the control booth, waiting for the censors to cut the feed.
To be brooding and sensual. That's all I get is an adorable cute. Men don't like to be called cute. Would you like to be called cute?
Well, I'd take it over a few others, but I prefer... But cute is one of your... Did I get out of that one?
Yeah, you're getting out of it.
Cute's one of your... You are cute, sorry.
Well, that's nice, thank you.
You're stuck with it.
Well, such is the burden we go through life with. Mr. Cute will be back in just a moment.
But Johnny wasn't just nervous, he was fascinated. He recognized that Midler represented a massive generational shift, a bohemian explosion that was rendering the old, polite Hollywood obsolete. He couldn't control her, so he did the only thing a smart king could do. He let her run wild, even if it meant he had to spend the entire interview on the defensive, clutching his coffee mug like a shield. While Bette Midler used raw, counterculture chaos to disarm Carson, Dolly Parton used something far more dangerous: absolute, hyperfeminine strategic brilliance. By the mid-1970s, Johnny Carson had a reputation for being a bit of a flirt on air. When attractive female guests sat on his couch, Johnny would often deploy slick, double entendres and charming, Midwestern wolfish grins. The studio audience loved it, and most guests played along, acting flattered or giggling at his cleverness. On January 19, 1977, Dolly Parton walked through the curtain for her very first appearance. She was a vision of hyperfemininity, towering blonde wigs, a cinched waist, rhinestones glittering under the studio lights, and an anatomy that had already become the punchline of late-night monologue jokes across the country. To the average viewer in 1977, Dolly looked like the ultimate target for Johnny's typical late-night banter. Johnny leaned in, a mischievous smirk on his face. He looked at her, then looked toward the audience and delivered a line that would shock modern broadcast standards. "I would give about a year's pay to peek under there." The audience gasped and laughed. It was the ultimate alpha move from the king of late night. He had laid the trap, expecting the country girl from the hills of Tennessee to blush, act demure, or lose her footing. Instead, Dolly Parton didn't even blink. She let out a warm, musical laugh, leaned directly toward Johnny, and with a razor-sharp smile, turned the tables instantly. "Oh, Johnny," she said, "you don't have to pay a year's salary. People are always telling me my look is fake, but I tell them, these are mine and I'm proud of them. I just chose to get people's attention with my look before I showed them my real talent." Before Johnny could recover, she cracked another joke about her own anatomy, beating him to his own punchline. In that exact fraction of a second, the power dynamic shifted entirely. The archival footage captures it perfectly. Johnny Carson's face turns a bright, unmistakable shade of pink. He completely stops looking at the camera. His hands begin to frantically shuffle his interview cards, and he takes an uncharacteristically long sip from his RCA coffee mug just to buy himself time to think. He was completely speechless. Dolly Parton had just executed an Appalachian masterclass in psychological warfare. She knew exactly how mainstream Hollywood viewed her. She knew they saw her poverty-stricken background in a one-room cabin on the banks of the Little Pigeon River and assumed she was naive. What Johnny didn't realize was that Dolly was the first member of her family to graduate high school, had survived the cutthroat streets of Nashville since the morning after her graduation, and was a corporate visionary in disguise. Dolly didn't let Johnny objectify her. She objectified herself first, using it as a shield to protect her immense talent as a songwriter and business mogul. By the mid-1980s, she would partner with Hershon Family Entertainment to rebrand a theme park into Dollywood, turning herself into a multi-million-dollar corporate entity. When she sat on Johnny's couch in the subsequent years, she wasn't auditioning for Hollywood approval. She was a corporate titan running a marketing clinic. Johnny quickly realized that he couldn't play his usual flirtatious games with Dolly. Every time he tried, she would outcharm him, outwit him, and leave him looking like a flustered schoolboy while she held the entire studio audience in the palm of her hand. While Dolly Parton brought calculations, actress Angie Dickinson brought something that deeply rattled Johnny on a purely personal level: genuine, unscripted romantic leverage. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Angie Dickinson was one of the most popular and captivating actresses in America, starring in the hit series Police Woman. She was sophisticated, stunningly beautiful, and possessed a cool, confident sexuality that matched Johnny's own suave persona. But whenever Angie was booked on The Tonight Show, the atmosphere backstage altered radically. Production crew members from that era would later note that Johnny's typical pre-show routine changed completely on Angie nights. Normally, Johnny was a creature of intense habit, isolated in his dressing room, intensely focused on his monologue, and preferring to be left entirely alone. But when Dickinson was on the guest list, Johnny became noticeably fastidious about his wardrobe. He would spend significantly longer in front of the mirror, adjusting his lapels, checking his hair, and exhibiting an unusual, nervous energy before stepping out onto the stage. The reason was a closely guarded Hollywood secret at the time. Johnny and Angie were quietly dating off-camera. This private history completely destabilized Johnny's on-air persona. On October 29, 1981, Angie sat on the couch wearing an elegant outfit, her eyes locked onto Johnny's. Throughout the interview, the traditional boundaries of a talk show host and guest dissolved. Dickinson didn't treat Johnny like the terrifying king of late night. She treated him like a man she knew intimately. During the segment, Johnny attempted to perform a series of standard card tricks, a hobby he had loved since his childhood days as a magician named the Great Carsoni. Usually, Johnny executed these tricks with flawless precision, using them to show off his dexterity and charm the audience. But Angie didn't let him maintain his professional distance. She leaned in close, her shoulder brushing against his, and began to playfully disrupt his routine, teasing him about his technique and making subtle, inside jokes that only the two of them fully understood. The effect on Johnny was immediate and profound. His hands, usually so steady, began to fumble with the cards. He dropped a card, mixed up the order of the deck, and stumbled over his words. He was experiencing what production staff called an uncontrollable on-air tell. The slick, untouchable host was gone. In his place was a vulnerable man desperately trying not to let 30 million viewers see how deeply flustered he was by the woman sitting next to him. Dickinson weaponized their personal history with masterclass subtlety. She didn't reveal their secrets, but she held them over his head like an invisible sword. Every time Johnny tried to steer the interview back to her latest movie or television project, she would pull him back into a personal conversational dance. The public's desire to see Johnny Carson disarmed by a powerful, uninhibited woman was so intense that it actually created one of the greatest urban legends in the history of broadcasting. A moment that millions of Americans swear they saw with their own eyes, but which never actually happened. It is known as the Zsa Zsa Gabor cat myth. According to pop culture folklore, the glamorous Hungarian actress Zsa Zsa Gabor walked onto the Tonight Show set carrying a fluffy white Persian cat on her lap. She sat down on the couch, stroked the cat, looked at Johnny, and asked in her distinct accent, "Johnny, darling, would you like to pet my pussy?" To which Carson, without missing a beat, supposedly replied, "I'd love to, Zsa Zsa, but you'll have to remove that damn cat." For decades, this exchange was repeated in bars, comedy clubs, and water coolers across America. It was hailed as the greatest, sharpest ad-lib in television history. NBC was flooded with thousands of letters from fans asking for a tape of the legendary clip. There was only one problem. The footage did not exist. Both Zsa Zsa Gabor and Johnny Carson explicitly and repeatedly denied that the conversation ever took place. Production researchers combed through every single frame of The Tonight Show archives, checking every appearance Gabor ever made, and found absolutely nothing. The entire event was a massive case of collective hallucination. But the myth grew so powerful that it began to genuinely frustrate Carson. He prided himself on his actual, verified wit, and he hated that his most famous rumored line was something he had never said. The frustration boiled over on September 15, 1989. Actress and activist Jane Fonda was sitting on the couch, and during a lull in the conversation, she decided to playfully confront Johnny about the rumor, asking him point-blank if it was true. Johnny sighed, threw his hands up in the air, and looked directly into the camera. He laughed, but his voice carried a distinct edge of exhaustion. He explained for the 100th time that it was a total urban legend, a complete fabrication of the public imagination. Why did this myth capture the American consciousness so deeply? Because it perfectly symbolized the exact dynamic that made Carson's audience tune in every night. The thrilling possibility of seeing an uninhibited, powerful woman push Johnny into a corner from which his mid-century sensibilities could not escape. While Bette Midler, Dolly Parton, and Angie Dickinson made Johnny nervous for brief, electric moments on the couch, there was one woman who represented a permanent, structural threat to his entire late-night empire. Her name was Joan Rivers. Joan's relationship with Johnny Carson is one of the most complex, tragic, and fiercely intense sagas in the history of show business. It began on February 17, 1965. At the time, Joan was a desperate, 31-year-old comedian grinding through the small clubs of Greenwich Village. She was constantly told by industry bookers that women were too emotional to succeed in stand-up comedy. Her own family viewed her ambitions as a deep embarrassment. She had auditioned for The Tonight Show multiple times and had been rejected by researchers who found her style too abrasive. But on that night in 1965, she finally got her shot. Joan walked out and delivered a manic, self-deprecating monologue about her struggles with dating, her looks, and her family's desperation to marry her off. It was raw and neurotic, and unlike anything a woman had ever performed on television. When she finished, she walked over to the couch. Johnny looked at her, bypassed all standard network protocols, and declared live on the air, "You're going to be a big star." With those 7 words, Johnny didn't just kickstart her career, he anointed her. Over the next 2 decades, Joan became a staple of the show. She viewed him as her mentor, her savior, and her closest industry friend. By September 1983, Joan's popularity had reached such heights that NBC officially designated her as Carson's permanent guest host. Whenever Johnny took a week off, which he did frequently as he grew older, Joan stepped behind the desk. And that is when the dynamic began to shift from mutual respect to intense internal anxiety. When Joan hosted, the ratings didn't drop. In fact, her demographic numbers among younger viewers and women frequently matched or even exceeded Johnny's. She brought a sharp, gossipy, high-octane energy to the desk that made Johnny's traditional Midwestern style look suddenly outdated. For the first time in his career, Johnny Carson was looking over his shoulder. He was an incredibly private, deeply insecure man who protected his late-night throne with ruthless efficiency. He began to realize that the woman he had created, the protégé he had anointed, was now fully capable of replacing him. The tension backstage began to build. Joan felt the shifting air. Despite her massive success, NBC executives refused to give her a long-term contract or guarantee that she would inherit the show if Johnny retired. She was quietly informed by industry insiders that she was on an internal target list of hosts to be passed over when the network eventually chose a permanent successor. She was 53 years old, facing rampant industry ageism, and terrified of being discarded by the network she had helped build. Then came May 1986. The newly formed Fox network was desperate to make a splash in late-night television. They approached Joan with an astronomical offer, a $10 million contract over 3 years to host her own late-night program, The Late Show starring Joan Rivers. It was an independent empire of her own, a historic achievement for a female performer. But Fox demanded absolute secrecy during the negotiations. Joan, terrified that NBC would fire her instantly if they found out, agreed to the terms. She fully intended to call Johnny personally the moment the deal was finalized to explain her anxieties and thank him for everything he had done. She never got the chance. News of Joan's deal with Fox leaked to the press via a sudden conference before she could place her call to Johnny. When she finally picked up the phone at her home and dialed Johnny's private line, her heart was in her throat. Johnny answered. Joan began to speak, trying frantically to explain the contract, the fears of ageism, and her deep love for him. Johnny listened in complete, icy silence. When she finished her sentence, he delivered 5 cold words. "I don't believe it." And he hung up the phone. Johnny Carson viewed Joan's move as an unforgivable personal and professional betrayal. In his mind, he had built her career from nothing. He had protected her, validated her, and given her his desk. To negotiate a deal with a rival network behind his back was a declaration of war against his kingdom. The retaliation was swift, absolute, and utterly ruthless. Johnny instituted a total lifetime ban on Joan Rivers from The Tonight Show. He refused to ever speak her name on camera again. His immense industry power radiated throughout Hollywood. Guests were quietly warned that if they appeared on Joan's new Fox show, they might find themselves permanently unwelcome on Johnny's couch. The fallout was catastrophic for Joan. The Late Show starring Joan Rivers was plagued by network interference, executive disputes, and falling ratings. Within 7 months, Fox fired her. Shortly after her firing, her husband and executive producer, Edgar Rosenberg, tragically committed suicide, leaving Joan emotionally shattered, professionally destitute, and completely blacklisted by the powerful NBC family. When Johnny Carson retired in May 1992, his successor, Jay Leno, maintained the ban out of a fierce, protective loyalty to Johnny's memory. The freeze lasted for an astonishing 28 years. An entire generation of television viewers grew up without ever seeing the woman who had once co-ruled late-night step foot in the NBC studios. The banishment remained an open, bleeding wound in Joan's life, a stark reminder of the absolute coldness that lay behind Johnny Carson's charming television smile. The circle would finally close on February 17, 2014. Exactly 49 years to the day of her original debut with Johnny. The new host, Jimmy Fallon, invited Joan back to the Tonight Show desk. As she stepped through the curtain at 80 years old, the crowd erupted into a prolonged standing ovation. Joan sat on the couch, looked around the studio, and wept. She had outlived the ban, she had outlived the blacklist, but the ghost of Johnny Carson still hung heavy over the room. By May 1992, the era of Johnny Carson was coming to a definitive, historic end. After 30 years, the king was stepping down from his throne. The final weeks of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson were treated like a national mourning period, with millions of viewers tuning in to say goodbye to an American institution. For his penultimate episode, May 21st, 1992, Johnny chose his final guests carefully. He didn't book world leaders or typical Hollywood leading men. He booked the manic brilliance of Robin Williams and the raw, emotional force of nature who had rattled him 22 years earlier, Bette Midler. The atmosphere in the studio that night was thick with unspoken grief and history. Robin Williams delivered a high-octane performance, but when it was Betty's turn, the comedic energy dissolved. Midler sat on the couch, looking at Johnny not with the brassy defiance of her youth, but with a deep, reverent affection. She had come to perform a final serenade for the man who had watched her grow from a bathhouse cult act into an EGOT legend. She stepped to the center of the stage. The lights went down, leaving only a single spotlight illuminating her and Johnny behind his desk. The director made a unique, unprecedented production decision. He used a custom camera angle that tracked both Midler's performance and Carson's face in the same frame. Midler began to sing the classic saloon song by Johnny Mercer and Harold Arlen, "One for My Baby and One More for the Road." Her voice was raw, heavy, and full of operatic emotion. She sang directly to him, transforming the lyrics into a personal conversation between two titans who knew that a monumental chapter of American culture was dying right before their eyes. "Set him up, Joe. I got a little story you ought to know." As the song progressed, something extraordinary happened. Johnny Carson, a man who had spent 30 years hiding his true feelings behind a cool, Midwestern detached facade, completely lost his composure. The mask shattered. In the tight camera shot, you can see Johnny's chin begin to tremble. His eyes fill with water, and a single, unmistakable tear runs down his cheek on national television. He doesn't look away. He doesn't try to crack a joke to break the tension. He simply sits there, exposed, vulnerable, and completely overwhelmed by the emotional weight of her performance. Immediately after finishing the final note, Midler was so overcome with emotion that she broke character, turned around, and ran off the stage into the wings just before she broke down into heavy sobbing. She couldn't handle the intensity of what they had just shared. It remains the most iconic, emotional apex in the history of late-night television. Bette Midler had done what no executive, no rival host, and no interviewer had ever been able to do. She had completely stripped away Johnny Carson's armor, leaving him naked before his audience. On May 22, 1992, the actual final night of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, there were no guests. The famous couch was left completely empty. Johnny sat alone on a stool in the center of the stage, speaking directly to his audience, showing retrospective clips of his 30-year run, and saying a quiet, dignified goodbye. The structural decision to leave the couch empty on that final night carried an immense, unspoken truth. No one could follow the emotional weight of the night before. Bette Midler had effectively served as the final true guest Johnny Carson would ever interview on The Tonight Show. When we look back at the legendary tenure of Johnny Carson, we remember the laughs, the characters, and the flawless monologues. But the true depth of his legacy is found in the moments when his control was challenged. The women who made Johnny Carson nervous, Joan Rivers, Dolly Parton, Bette Midler, and Angie Dickinson, did something profound for the architecture of American media. They didn't just survive his kingdom, they redefined it. They proved that a woman on television didn't have to be submissive to be successful. They could be neurotically aggressive, hyperfeminine, chaotically theatrical, or intimately commanding. They forced the king of late night to drop his guard, alter his strategies, fumble his cards, and shed his tears. In doing so, they didn't just make Johnny Carson nervous. They made him human.